them golden slippers. Da 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 da, bum bum bum, da da da.
I've been standing here at the corner of Main and East Street in the oldest part of Amherst since 1839. I've talked to you so often, God, during the last 150 years. Of course, you've been here from the very beginning, and I can't tell you anything you don't already know. But today, I feel like reminiscing. I know that you work in mysterious ways, God, but I never could have imagined what you had in store for me. Remember what it was like here when that first Jewish family arrived? It was 1904. Amherst was such a small, sleepy little town, a beautiful rural spot nestled in the valley. Main Street wasn't even paved then. We were hardly aware of what went on beyond our own area and didn't give much thought to the events in Europe that were bringing loads of immigrants to our country. In 1904, Amherst was a conservative Republican town. One could hardly find a Democrat among our 5,000 residents. The schools, then as now, were our pride and joy. We didn't realize that our Massachusetts Agricultural College, or Mass Aggie as it was called, with its first class of 45 students, would become the major public university of the Commonwealth. It would join Amherst, Smith, Mount Holyoke, and Hampshire to make us a national educational center. What a contrast Amherst was to the teeming East Side ghettos of New York, with its poverty, crowded tenements, and dangerous sweatshops. Most of those newcomers, seeking a better life in America, arrived and settled in the large urban areas, but some chose a different path. Isaac and Sarah Labrovitz were Russian Jews. Sarah remained there with her two children, Ed and Rose, while her husband came to America. He arrived in New York City, worked as a tailor, and then sent for his family. A few years later, they chose Amherst for their new home. It seemed like a fine place to put down roots. Although Isaac was a tailor by trade, he was also an entrepreneur. He set up shop and bought the wooden block where the Jones Library now stands. The family lived over the shop. It was like the experience of many immigrant families. Although all learned English quickly, it was spoken only on the outside. At home, they spoke Yiddish. Most of the business activity of the town centered around the big corner, Pleasant, Amity, and Main Streets, and Isaac and Sarah became part of the commercial scene. Sarah was an amazing woman. Not only did she work along with her husband in the shop, she also tended to the needs of her 8 children and still found time to read and talk to the professors who came to their store. She counted among her dear friends the Reverend Ives of the Unitarian Church, and she didn't hesitate to express her opinion at town meetings. The family did not observe many religious practices, but Isaac wanted his first son to have a bar mitzvah. But let Ed himself tell about it.
There was a Jewish student at Aggie who taught me Hebrew for pennies an hour. I don't know what it might be. And he used to come to the house and would teach me. But more than that, I used to take the trolley car at 3:30 from the center of Amherst to go to Northampton. I was excused from school at 3:15, would walk up from the Kellogg Avenue School to take the trolley car, and sometimes have a great big burlap bag with me for shopping at some Jewish place in Northampton to bring back something or other in the burlap bag, which I didn't like much, but I did. At any rate, later, and we may have had 10 or 12 Jewish boys in the Cheder, in the basement of the show.
Life was slow, quiet, and gentle, and kids had to make their own fun. For the Labrovitz brood, fun often involved music. Their house was something of a youth center. Brother Mac was a great drummer, Sister Rose played ragtime piano, and Ed was a talented banjo player. They called themselves Jerry's Jazz Band. The house rang with the sounds of their jam sessions, and Gentile kids and Jewish kids from town and colleges used to come in by trolley on the weekends, and they had a ball. Ed was in one of the first classes to graduate from the new high school. He went on to Mass Aggie, then Amherst College, and received his law degree from Yale. By then, the family name had been changed to Landis. He settled in Springfield and was an active attorney until his death in 1988. Ed always said that it was a privilege to have grown up in Amherst, and he always felt a part of it. It was his hometown. You can hear him now playing his beloved banjo. During the first quarter of the century, a few other Jewish families arrived. There were the Epsteins, who were related to the Labrovitzes and came to Amherst via New York. And there were the Levines, Joseph and Rose Ginsburg, Meyer and Ida Novick, families whose children were educated in Amherst. There were others, but they stayed too briefly to have had any impact. By the 1920s, Amherst High School had a small but very active group of Jewish students, all children of Yiddish-speaking parents. Leo Novick was the editor of the high school newspaper, and his parents, Ida and Meyer, had a tailor shop on Pleasant Street. Ida was fondly referred to as Ma Novick by Jewish students from Mass Aggie who boarded with the family. She and other women in town became surrogate mothers and offered friendship and probably chicken soup to youngsters who were far from home. Bessie Levine also worked on the school newspaper. Other Jewish students played in the band, were athletes, and quite a few won prizes in oratory contests. Almost all went on to college. Remember Sadie Ginsburg, the cobbler's daughter who became a gifted pianist? Her family was very religious and kept a kosher home. That reminds me of some of the rumors that floated around town. The Ginsburgs used to go to Holyoke on the trolley and bring back large bundles of food. During Prohibition, some of the local folks suspected that the large bundles contained bootleg liquor. It was a family joke. Nothing much changed in Amherst during this first quarter of the century, although more of a Jewish presence was beginning to emerge at Mass Aggie. A young man arrived in 1924. His name was Maxwell Goldberg, and he enrolled as a freshman, majoring in poultry husbandry. Max had hoped to attend Harvard and study humanities, but he didn't get the scholarship he needed to pay for his education. His immigrant parents were influenced by the Zionist movement, which was sending many Jews to Palestine to reclaim the land and become farmers and pioneers. Well, Max changed his major and he didn't become a farmer, but he did become a different kind of pioneer here in the valley. After earning his doctorate in English at Yale, he returned to Amherst and was one of the first Jews on the faculty. He received national recognition as a scholar, writer, and teacher at a time when few Jews were even on college faculties. But he always found time to assist Jewish students and act as advisor to Jewish organizations. Max returned to the university to receive an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters in 1988 and described what it was like when he came here as a freshman in 1924. He discovered that there had been Jewish students before him, and although there were only about 8 others when he arrived, there was an established local fraternity called Delta Phi Alpha, which later became A Pi.
On campus, in addition to the fraternity, we had a chapter of the International Menorah Society, which was very active in New York and had among its members a number who later became, quotes, the Jewish intellectuals of our country, if not internationally. For you to get the flavor of the Jewish life here at that time, student life, some wag at chapel made an announcement. The Menorah Society will meet in the telephone, pay telephone booth in the Memorial Hall on such and such a day and such a time. And that was true. And the Menorah Society was the same as the fraternity. We just shifted from South College to the Memorial Hall and changed from being a fraternal gathering to a cultural gathering.
As I recall, there were never more than 4 or 5 Jewish families in town in the early 1900s, all immigrants, all shopkeepers. In 1927, the first American-born Jewish family arrived, David and Jenny Gordon and their 3-year-old son Joe. They opened their dry cleaning shop, Amherst Cleaners, which remained in business for more than 50 years. Joe Gordon described his youth in Amherst as busy but lonely. He was the only Jewish child in his class, and there was very little contact between his family and the other Jewish families in town. The Gordons observed Jewish traditions in their home and arranged for their son to receive a Jewish education. Students from Mass State College were hired as tutors, and the Northampton rabbi prepared Joe for his bar mitzvah. Although Joe left town after graduating from Amherst College, he speaks nostalgically of some of his earliest memories.
I remember, incidentally, certain things. I remember so much of going to the Jewish sections of Holyoke and of Springfield and buying food there, particularly on Passover time. And I remember also so much of my father buying live chickens at the farmers in the surrounding town or area of Amherst. And on a evening after work, he would load those chickens in a burlap bag into the truck, and he would go down to usually Holyoke, which was where they had a permanent rabbi, and find the shechad and have the chickens killed. And I remember so well how those chickens would go into the house kicking and squirming in that bag and come back as a piece of dead meat. And those memories still linger with me, particularly the cleaning of the chickens by my mother and the burning of the feathers. And every time I smell protein hair burning now, I think of those early days.
As one of the first Jewish faculty members, Max Goldberg played a central role in organizing and advising social, cultural, and religious activities at the school, as it changed from Mass Aggie to Mass State College and finally University of Massachusetts. His presence was felt not only on campus, but he provided a link with the town and also with regional and national organizations seeking to provide students with familiar Jewish experiences.
During the Second World War, I got a call from the National Jewish Welfare Board saying Passover is coming. There are meteorological students at Amherst College, and we had Air Force students. This was used as a transitional station before the bombardiers and the others were separated and sent to different places, Maxwell Field and so on. And so we had big contingents here in Amherst, and we had an anti-Semitic commandant. And so when the Jewish Welfare Board said, Dr. Goldberg, if we furnished you wine and matzah and the makings of Knedlach, would you undertake to stage a Seder for the Jewish military students in the Amherst area. So I agreed to do that. And the wine came, and the matzah came, and the materials for the Kneach came. But I couldn't get permission from Colonel Oh, I shouldn't mention names here, should I? You'll expunge that, perhaps. It was to dot the I's and cross the T's. He wouldn't give permission. And so I went to one of my dear friends, the Protestant chaplain, Easton, and the Catholic chaplain, and told them of my dilemma. And they said, don't worry, Max, we'll take care of it. So the Protestant chaplain announced that he was going to have permission. What the commandant said was he couldn't spare the Jewish students from their duties, see, that night. So that night turned out to be Thursday, and there was Maundy Thursday for the Episcopalians. So the Protestant chaplain said, well, I can't, I want my students for Maundy Thursday. You have to release them. And the Catholic chaplain, for some reason, said he needed his students. So together they insisted that the permission be granted, and they offered to take care of one another's needs if there's coverage necessary. So he had no excuse for that. And when it came to getting the soup, I call it a model Seder. And Rabbi Herschel Levin of Springfield, who was Hebrew Union Council of the Jewish students, he came in and he officiated at one of the tables at the then Tep House and at A Pie House, and I took care of getting one set up at the then Tau Epsilon Phi House, and I had a young Air Force cadet whose father was an Air Force colonel to lead. He happened to be Jewishly knowledgeable to lead that Seder, and so we had the two Seders. And when I listened to them, you know, when they dip and mutter the curses, I heard that they were cursing the colonel and they were cursing the local captain, and they were doing it with great zeal. And after the Seder, the phones were terrifically busy. They were largely students from New York, from the Bronx and Brooklyn, and they were calling, "Ma, we've had a Seder. Ma, we've had a Seder." So you see what a change of climate.
Max paved the way for later arrivals. A handful of faculty families arrived in the 40s and 50s, but it wasn't until the 60s and 70s, during the great expansion period at the university, that larger numbers began to arrive. And it was this influx which would later form a real community, the Jewish community of Amherst. And Amherst would change from a homogeneous Yankee town to a vibrant community of many cultures and religion, rich in its diversity and an educational center of distinction. And who would ever have thought that bagels would be as popular as donuts here? But let's go back to 1931, when Mass Aggie became Massachusetts State College and the number of Jewish students had increased. One of those students was Art Levine, who came from the Boston area. He was surprised to find an active Jewish fraternity with about 30 students, as well as a cultural group, the Menorah Society, which even had 3 or 4 women members. Since most of the Jewish students were from the Boston area, they tended to go home for the Jewish holidays. Since tradition and food often go hand in hand, it was not unusual for a kosher salami, bologna, and other good things to be tucked in with packages from home. After graduating from Mass State in 1939, Art became a member of the faculty. And in 1941, when the United States entered World War II, Art joined the Army.
By the time I returned from service, my son Peter, whom I had never seen, was 3.5 years old. I returned to find difficult times in Amherst. Housing was short, rents were frozen, and it took a while to adjust to civilian life. During World War II, the Fort Devens campus opened. It closed in 1949 and was absorbed by Amherst. That influx caused quite an increase in the student body. The college became the University of Massachusetts in 1947, and many of the changes occurring in both town and campus made a vast difference. At that time, Amherst was like many of the small towns in the region, slow-paced and quite Republican conservative. You could have lived here for 3 or 4 generations and still be considered a newcomer. The merchants had no competition. Most of the people were open and accepting, but there were a few areas that were restricted for blacks and Jews.
There was still no kind of Jewish community. In fact, when Art wanted his son to become bar mitzvah, his experience was pretty much the same as it had been for the earliest Jewish families. By the late 1950s, the number of Jewish residents had increased. Most of them were faculty members. They formed a loosely organized group who got together for Jewish holidays and cultural events. Some of these new young families were eager to organize a Sunday school here in town instead of having to travel to the synagogue in Northampton. A group of volunteer teachers provided instruction for 20 children who met in the Masonic Hall. And a few years later, many of those in the adult social group merged with those involved with the school. And in 1969, 31 families joined to incorporate. The merger, however, resulted in too many children from Masonic Hall, so classes moved to the common school. Finding locations for the various activities was complicated. At one point, the schedule was Shabbat services in the Lutheran Church, classes in Masonic Hall, special minions in members' homes, high holiday services in Johnson Chapel at Amherst College, Sunday school at the UMass School of Business Administration, and Hebrew school at the Newman Center. The next 7 years were difficult, but filled with many firsts and many happy memories. Sorting things out remains a challenge since much of the archives were destroyed by fire. After a 2-year search for a permanent home, it seemed like another of your many wonders took place. The members of the Second Congregational Church were concerned about their dwindling numbers, but felt that it was important to use the buildings for religious purposes. The two groups were able to work out a satisfactory arrangement, and the transfer was made. The goodwill on the part of both groups was a sort of cooperation that is a unique quality of the Amherst community. Oh, it makes my steeple spin to think of all that has happened in the last 2 decades. Things started to get rather hectic in the 1960s as the town and the university expanded and changed. Life seemed almost as tumultuous as it was in the 1770s. My original congregation, after almost 200 years of separation, was being reconciled with the First Congregational Church, and a different form of worship was taking place within my walls. I was actually converted to the Jewish community of Amherst on May 1st, 1977, in a formal dedication ceremony. The beautiful menorah from the Amherst Council of Churches and the American flag from the American Legion remain permanent reminders of the welcome given by the people of Amherst. Although much interior remodeling has taken place over the years, the exterior and spire, with its acorn finial perched on top, a symbol of vigor and growth, remained unchanged, even though my steeple has started to lean a bit. My new family put in a unique ark, especially designed to match my style and hold the precious Torahs. The sanctuary also holds a Torah that was rescued from a synagogue in Czechoslovakia. Those people perished in the Holocaust, but their memory lives on in Amherst. There's so much more to tell. So many people contributed, but it will have to wait for another time. It's getting late. Of course, God, you know these people well. After all, you gave them the best-selling book of all time, the Bible. They're still reading it in the original language, although, to be honest, most of the people here have to look at the English translation. And speaking of books, the Yiddish Book Center is a close neighbor of mine. It was started in 1982 and is housed in the former East Street School. Now it's recognized internationally for its work in preserving Yiddish writings. Those earliest arrivals would be amazed to see the crowded sanctuary and social hall when holidays are celebrated. At a recent Purim festivity, young and old donned costumes and listened to the traditional reading of the Megillah. There were cheers for the heroes, boos for the villain, and the evening ended with delicious hamantaschen and music and dancing for all to enjoy. The Jews of Amherst are made up of all kinds, believers and non-believers. Some come for religion, others for cultural activities, some come for the social life, and all seem to enjoy the familiar holiday foods. They love to talk and discuss, agree and disagree, but most of all, these people of the book love being part of a community where learning is cherished, where tradition is defined more by its spirit and history than by a specific form. It seems to suit them well and makes a perfect match with a town centered on education. Just one more thing, God. After more than a decade, it still makes me laugh when strangers inspect my features and with an air of puzzlement murmur, "Funny, you don't look Jewish."